Let's begin with a prayer of preparation today. Lord, our hearts are open to you now, so please help us to understand more clearly this risen life that you have called us to. Help us today especially to understand the passion with which we must live this new life. Help us to understand fully what it means to live passionately the life of Christ in the world today. Help us to think on that and to explore the various ideas we need to explore in order to have more of that passion so that we might live to your glory now and forever. Amen. This is our second message in the current 4-sermon series on the visions of the resurrection. As you remember, we are focusing upon 4 of these visions that were had by various people in the time and the day of the resurrection. Last week we looked at Mary Magdalene and focused upon the idea of hearing the living voice of God. That's part of the risen life. Today we're going to focus upon the passion of the risen life. And I would focus upon this last verse of the 24th chapter of Luke, which we just read earlier today, in which the disciples looked at each other after Jesus had appeared to them and then disappeared. They looked at each other and said, "Did not our hearts burn within us?" That's passion, the burning heart. The heart that is alive and burning with a desire to be like Christ in the world. That's part of the resurrection experience. And if we are to live the resurrected life, we need to know more and more about how to live passionately, because if we do not live passionately, then the world does not take us very seriously. The world always takes seriously those people who live with passion, because actually in this world nothing great is ever done unless people have that passion to do it. So, as Christians, we really need to evaluate our own level of passion. Just how much do our hearts burn within us for the living Christ and the life of Christ in this world? We can always improve. And that's what we're trying to do, is just get better and better and better. But we need to see, where are we on the scale of 1 to 10 as far as our passion is concerned. So today I would like to explore with you briefly this idea of the passion of Christ and what it really means for us to have that passion. You know, people always talk about the passion of Christ. Well, yes, of course, Christ had a tremendous passion. But what we must talk about is our passion for the Christ. And that's what I wish to speak about today, is that subject. The founder of the United Methodist Church, John Wesley, back in 1770, made a famous statement in one of his sermons. He said, "You know, if you give me 10 passionate Christians, not even the gates of hell can stand against us." And that's so true. A little passion goes a long ways. And if ever there was a day and a time when Christianity needs to rediscover the passion of living for Christ, it's today, because we've just gotten to this point where it's really no longer a passionate matter. It's a kind of a, well, okay, I will get engaged when I have time, or I'll do what I can do, or I'm not going to get overly excited about it. Christianity has become a situation in which people are really no longer hot for Christ. They're no longer hot for spreading the good news of God's love in this world. They're no longer really hot about it. Perhaps it's the times in which we live, in which there's so much disagreement and so many different opinions and so many people thinking this way and thinking that way. People are afraid to stand up and say, no, the only thing worth living for is Christ. And that's what I live for. That's passion. That's the passion that I want us to have. That's the passion I want every Christian to have. It's this passion that lives as if Christ's life in us was the only thing there was. Now, you know, as I've thought about it and how I could maybe share some thoughts with you about different aspects of passion, it occurs to me that over the years I've been able to analyze it such that I can see at least 3 different aspects of this passion. And each one of them is extremely important. So I'm going to spend a few moments on each one and hopefully illustrate it in such a way that you can begin to understand whether or not in your own life you have that part of passion for Christ. The first one is this, and it's one that is probably most overlooked. It's the one that people don't really understand why it's that important. It is immediacy. Immediacy. The passion of Christ is an immediate thing. It is an immediacy that has in it the element of now, not tomorrow, not the next day, but now, now, now. I didn't know this until I went to seminary, but if you study the Greek language, in the Gospel of Mark, for instance, the word immediate is used 27 times. It's the most frequently used word in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus immediately went this way. Jesus immediately said this. All throughout that Gospel, that little word immediately, immediately. I didn't realize it, but when I went to check it, it's absolutely true. The Gospel writer understood that the passion that we have in the resurrected life is about doing it now. Doing it right now. And not ever thinking about doing it at any other time. I tried to think of ways in which I could describe this immediacy to hopefully enable you to begin to think about whether or not that's how you react to the Christ in your life. And as it would be, I got to thinking about my seminary days, and I went back and I reviewed some of the times I had there, and I remembered a course I took, which was called Christ and Culture, and this was in 1972. It was quite an interesting course. The whole idea was to look at the current culture of the time in 1972 and see how it might help us to understand the Christ in our world. And so we had to write a paper for that class. It was a thesis we had to write. And at the beginning, after they explained to us what all we were going to be studying and how we were going to study it, they made us decide what topic we would choose. And they gave us some choices. Each one of us, they gave 2 choices about certain things that were highly impacting the culture of 1972. And the 2 they gave me was movie sex scenes or Alice Cooper. Well, I chose movie sex scenes. Why not? And the whole idea was to look at that part of culture and see what it might teach us about Christ's presence in our life. And we were looking for analogies. We were looking for illustrations of how these parts of our culture might help us to understand things. Well, you know, back in the 1970s, one of the great movies that came out that was very popular was Last Tango in Paris. And that was, of course, one of the key movies to look at for that particular subject of sex scenes in the movies. And so I tried my best to study those things and see what I might could learn. And of course, at first I was thinking that, well, this is showing us how sex has become so cheap. It's showing us how it's become simply a way of making other people into sex objects. And it was a way of us understanding that people were using this sex as a way to escape their problems, and that Christ was the only answer that they could find to escape from that kind of misery. And I thought maybe I was on to a thought and that I could research the different aspects of it. And I looked at several other movies. And yes, there was that theme about how sex had become so abusive, and it had become so violent, and it had become so hard and brutal. But you know, the more I watched those scenes, I began to think there's something else here that might teach us about the passion of Christ. And I began to realize that in every one of those sex scenes, in every one of those movies, whenever that scene was getting ready to happen, people didn't just twiddle their thumbs and wait. It was an immediate thing. People in the movies just tore off their clothes and just went after it with as much gusto as they possibly could. We got to do this now, and we're going to do it right this now. And the more I looked at every one of those scenes, I began to realize that was the message coming through. Immediacy. In those particular settings, this was what was the major important thing. There was no putting it off. There was no let's wait till another day. There was no overnight bags. It was just let's get after it, and let's get after it now. And the more I studied it, I was able to write a thesis on the immediacy of the passion of Christ. And what I understood from that was that if we had the same immediacy in our hearts to give love to others, to touch others' lives, to help others. If we had that same immediacy that these people in the movies had when they wanted to have sex, if we had that same immediacy, this world would be a whole different world. And so I developed it from there into the idea of being those who immediately respond to Christ's call. You know, we have had this experience here at ICC in the last week or two where we were contacted by Global Giving, an organization in the United States, in which they have offered our ministry here called Creatua Espacio a $5,000 matching grant for their attempt to try to buy laptops for these refugee children. And the problem was they gave us only a small window, 12 days. Raise $5,000 and we'll match it. I remember when I first heard that, I said, that's impossible. How are we going to do that? And at first I was just thinking, well, we'll announce it and see if anybody has some donations they can make. But then I began to realize this was an opportunity of a lifetime. This organization will never, ever get that kind of money given to them for any other reason. And so in my own life, I realized it's time to act now. And so I thought, how can we do it? How can we do it? And eventually we came up with this plan we have. And now we're almost there. I think we've got over 40 donors at this point. And by the time the rest of our money comes in, we'll be at 4,500, which is very close to the 5,000 that we need. So my point is simply this. When the call to love comes, we do not procrastinate. When the call to love comes, we don't put it off. When the call to love comes, we get after it as quickly and as fast as we can. And so, that's the first aspect of the passion of Christ. It's to have that immediacy. Now, the second one is this, the ultimate concern. If you have the passion of Christ, Christ is your ultimate concern. Living the Christ life is your only concern. And you just dedicate yourself to nothing but that. And anytime you can do anything in that respect, you do it. And you do it right away. The story is told about Handel, the great composer, who, as you know, wrote the piece called The Messiah. And that piece has probably been one of the greatest of all pieces of Christian music for celebrating the gospel. But the point I want to make is that when Handel started to write The Messiah and to compose it, he said that all of a sudden the singular idea came to his mind of an oratory that would be both Christmas and Easter together. And he envisioned it all at one time in his mind, what it would sound like. And so he began to write. And it was his ultimate concern to get it down on paper as quickly as he could, because he believed it was the greatest idea he could ever put to music, the idea of God's love for his people. And so when he began to write, he wrote with such passion. I think they say it took 25 to 27 days for him to write that massive thing. He didn't sleep, he didn't eat, hardly went to the bathroom, just totally dedicated himself to writing, composing, writing, composing. Those who have studied it say that in order for him to have done that, he would had to have written 15 notes every minute for 24 hours a day. That's a lot. That's an ultimate concern. That's what I mean when I talk about ultimate concern. When you realize that living this life that is lived for others so that you can forget yourself, so that you can be of use, help, and benefit to others. When you realize how important that is, and that that's your only reason to be alive, then you have the passion. And that's the second thing about having the passion of Christ. It's having that ultimate concern to get it out, to live it holistically and completely. Now, the third one that I had in mind for today is that the passion we have for Christ is undeniable. There are many people who want us to deny Christ in our lives today. They want us to say that something else is important, more important. But we know better. And so, for us, the love we have for the Christ life is undeniable. The story is told from World War II. That the Japanese army had discovered a small fellowship of Christians on one of the islands in the Philippines. And the officer in charge had gathered all those Christians together on the beach, and he had a Shinjinko sword, and he drew a line in the sand. And he told these Christians, he said, now, if you will step across this line and deny that you love this Christ, I will let you live. But if you don't, I will cut your head off with this sword. And we will see the truths. All of those people did not step across the line. And they all had their heads cut off that day. That's undeniable passion. And that's also what I'm trying to get across here today. So then those are the three things I want to try to say today about what it's like to have passion. And if we have these, then we know we are living with passion for Christ. Amen.